Before Warren Buffett was the world's most trusted billionaire, he was a 6-year-old boy in Depression-era Omaha, hauling Coca-Cola door to door, counting nickels, and already refusing to lose. Chapter 1. Born to Count. The summer of 1930 was not a summer anyone wanted to be born into. Across America, banks were failing at a rate of roughly one per day. Men who had once worn good suits to good jobs were selling apples on street corners, their dignity reduced to a small pyramid of fruit and a cardboard sign. Bread lines stretched around city blocks in every direction. The word depression had stopped being a clinical term and become something people felt in their chests when they woke up in the morning. It was into this bleak national atmosphere that Warren Edward Buffett arrived on August 30, 1930, in Omaha, Nebraska, announcing himself to the world with all the fanfare of a baby who had absolutely no idea what he was getting into, and yet by almost every measure of his subsequent life, he could not have picked a better moment to begin paying attention. Omaha in those years was a city of stockyards and railroads, of grain merchants and river commerce, practical to its bones and suspicious of excess. It was not a city that trafficked in glamour. It was a city that believed in work, in ledgers, in the quiet satisfaction of a column of numbers that added up exactly right. Howard Buffett, Warren's father, fit Omaha like a key fits a lock. A stockbroker by trade, and later a congressman by calling, Howard brought the rhythms of the market home with him every evening the way other fathers brought the smell of oil or sawdust. The Buffett household hummed with talk of prices and value, of what things were worth and what people were foolishly paying for them instead. It was, in retrospect, an extraordinary kind of nursery. Howard was a serious man with serious convictions, devoted to his family and allergic to debt in a way that the Great Depression had burned into an entire generation. He watched his neighbors struggle, watched his clients suffer losses that sometimes destroyed not just their savings but their sense of self, and he emerged from those years with a bedrock belief that financial literacy was not a luxury but a form of self-defense. His dinner table was, in its way, a classroom, and his son was, almost from the very beginning, a disturbingly attentive student. Warren's mother, Leela, was sharp and exacting, a woman of considerable intelligence who channeled her considerable energies into raising her children with precision and expectation. The household she kept was orderly, demanding, and emotionally complex in ways that Warren would spend much of his life navigating quietly. But what the young boy absorbed most readily, almost hungrily, was not the emotional weather of the house but its intellectual climate. The numbers, the patterns, the endlessly fascinating puzzle of what things were actually worth. He could memorize things before most children could tie their shoes. By the time he was 3 or 4, he was reciting the populations of cities the way other children recited nursery rhymes, savoring the weight of large figures the way someone else might savor candy. When family friends visited, Warren would sometimes perform, asking someone to name a city, any city, and then reporting back its population with the calm confidence of a small professor who had already decided the world was, at bottom, a quantitative place. His grandfather, Ernest Buffett, ran a grocery store in Omaha called Buffett & Son, and it was there that Warren had his first real encounters with commerce as something more than abstraction. He was too small to see over the counter, but he was never too small to notice. He watched his grandfather make change, watched customers calculate whether they could afford a pound of butter or had to settle for half, watched the arithmetic of survival play out in small transactions repeated endlessly through the day. Something registered, something stuck. By age 6, Warren had identified his first business opportunity with a clarity that should probably have alarmed his parents more than it apparently did. He noticed that a 6-pack of Coca-Cola cost a quarter at his grandfather's store, which meant each bottle cost roughly 4 cents. He also noticed that neighbors and friends would pay a nickel for a single cold bottle, particularly in the Nebraska heat. The math was not complicated. Buy low, sell slightly higher, repeat. He began purchasing 6-packs with his allowance, loading them into a small metal bucket, and walking the neighborhood with the quiet determination of a tiny Midwestern capitalist. There is something both charming and slightly uncanny about the image. This small, round-faced boy trudging up and down Omaha sidewalks in the summer heat, bottles clinking, pocketing nickels with the seriousness of a man who understood, on some cellular level, that a penny earned was not merely a penny saved, but a penny that could, if treated correctly, become something considerably larger over time. His profit on each six-pack was 5 cents. This was not a fortune. But Warren Buffett was not thinking about fortunes. He was thinking about how to do the same thing again tomorrow. What his childhood friends were doing during those same years is mostly lost to history, which seems appropriate. They were being children. Warren was being something else. Not in a joyless way, not in the way of a small person robbed of play and forced into premature seriousness, but in the way of a boy who simply found numbers more thrilling than toys, who felt something close to joy when the math worked out. The depression swirled around his family, and there were anxieties. His father's brokerage business was not immune to the collapse of investor confidence, but inside the Buffett house, the conversation never stopped being about markets, about value, about the machinery of money and how it moved. That relentless domestic education planted something in Warren that no formal classroom could have engineered deliberately. He wasn't just learning facts. He was absorbing a way of seeing, the habit of looking at the world and asking not what something appeared to be worth, but what it actually was worth, and whether the gap between those two numbers represented an opportunity or a warning. He was 6 years old, selling Coca-Cola door to door, wearing a smile that masked the workings of a mind already calibrated to find signal in noise, value in the overlooked, and profit in the perfectly ordinary transaction that everyone else had simply stopped thinking about too carefully. The Great Depression eventually began to lift, slowly and unevenly, the way all great catastrophes recede, not with a dramatic announcement but with a gradual return of color to a landscape that had gone gray. Warren Buffett grew alongside the recovery, a boy with a bucket of Coca-Cola and a grandfather's grocery store, and a father who brought the stock market home to dinner, all of it combining into something none of them could quite see yet, the first faint outline of a mind that would one day change how the world thought about money, patience, and the extraordinary power of simply paying attention. Chapter 2. The Boy Entrepreneur. Before most kids on his block had learned to tie their shoes without thinking about it, Warren Buffett had a paper route. Then he had 2, then 5. He was up before the sun most mornings, pedaling through the dark streets of Omaha or Washington, D.C., depending on the season, tossing the Washington Post onto porches while his classmates slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of children who had not yet discovered that time, properly leveraged, was money. He also sold tips on racehorses. He was 10 years old. The product was a hand-typed sheet called Stable Boy Selections, which Warren peddled outside a local racetrack for 25 cents a copy. Whether the tips were any good was somewhat beside the point. The point was that he had figured out something most adults spend their whole lives missing. That information, packaged and delivered to the right person at the right moment, had value independent of whether you personally had any idea what you were talking about. He would later refine this insight considerably. The newspaper routes, though, were the real education, 5 of them at once, carefully mapped, timed, and optimized in ways that a logistics consultant would have recognized as genuinely impressive. Warren kept meticulous records of his earnings, tracked his costs, and thought seriously about how to wring more profit from every block. He wasn't just delivering papers, he was running a small, scrappy enterprise, and he knew it. The bicycle he used wasn't a toy, it was capital equipment. He was 11 years old and already thinking about depreciation, but 11 was also the year things got real in a different way. It was 1942, and Warren had been reading stock tables the way other boys read baseball box scores, obsessively, hungrily, convinced that somewhere in those columns of numbers was a code worth cracking. He had been watching a company called Cities Service Preferred for long enough that its price had settled into his memory like a song he couldn't shake. When the stock was trading at $38 per share, he made his move. He scraped together enough savings to buy 3 shares, not just for himself, but one for his sister Doris as well, because he had essentially talked her into the idea with the confidence of someone who definitely knew what he was doing. He did not, it turned out, entirely know what he was doing. Almost immediately, the stock dropped. It fell to $27, and Warren watched it happen with the specific, nauseating helplessness of someone who has put real money into a real thing and has now watched that real thing shrink. His sister noticed too. She did not let him forget it. He would recall later that she looked at him each morning at breakfast with an expression that communicated, wordlessly and devastatingly, the full weight of her displeasure. He was 11 years old and already learning that the emotional cost of investing other people's money is categorically different from investing your own. When the stock finally crawled back up to $40, he sold. All 3 shares, done, finished. He had made a modest profit for himself and for Doris, cleared his conscience, and could go back to breathing normally. Then City Service Preferred went to $220. He found this out the way you find out about the fish that got away, too late, and from someone who looked vaguely pleased to be the one telling you. The stock he had bought at $38 and sold at $40 because he couldn't stand the anxiety of watching it lose value had more than quintupled. Had he simply done nothing, the most technically demanding skill in investing, as it turns out, he would have multiplied his money 5 times over. Instead, he had panicked at the low, celebrated at the small recovery, and missed the actual destination entirely. He was 11. It was, he would later say, one of the most important lessons of his life. Not because losing money is fun, it isn't, but because the lesson was so clear and so painful that it cauterized itself into his memory permanently. Patience was not a nice quality to have. It was not a virtue you could borrow for the big moments and ignore the rest of the time. It was the whole game. Selling City's service at $40 wasn't a small mistake in tactics. It was a rehearsal for a kind of failure he was determined, from that day forward, to refuse. He went back to his paper roots. He kept his records. He kept reading. By the time he was 13, Warren Buffett was earning more money from his various enterprises than some of the adults in his neighborhood. Not dramatically more, but enough that it registered, enough that people noticed and made jokes about the serious boy who seemed constitutionally incapable of spending $1 when saving it was an option. He had a paper route income, residual revenue from his various entrepreneurial experiments, and the satisfaction of watching numbers in a ledger grow larger over time, which he found, quite genuinely, to be one of life's better pleasures. When tax season arrived, he sat down and filed his first federal income tax return at age 13. This was not something anyone made him do. This was something he did because it was the correct and logical thing to do given that he had income. He listed his earnings, he calculated what he owed, and then, with the calm precision of someone who had thought this through carefully, he deducted his bicycle as a business expense. He was right to do it. The bicycle was a business expense. He had used it to generate income on those pre-dawn routes, in the dark and the cold before school, in the kind of unglamorous, relentless early morning grind that nobody photographs or praises but that quietly adds up to something over time. The deduction was legitimate. It was also, for a 13-year-old, a remarkably sophisticated understanding of how the system worked, that the law didn't just take from you but offered, if you paid attention, small acknowledgments of the costs you bore in the act of earning. His friends were trading baseball cards. Warren Buffett was filing taxes and thinking about next year. There was something almost comic about it, the gap between his inner life and the life of a normal American boy his age. He wasn't miserable about the difference. He genuinely liked what he was doing, liked the puzzle of it, liked the feeling of problems that had actual solutions if you were willing to be honest and disciplined and patient. But even then, tucked inside the competence and the early confidence, was the memory of that stock chart climbing to $220 while he stood on the sidelines having already sold. That number stayed with him. It wasn't a wound exactly, it was more like a compass, always pointing in the same direction, reminding him of the single most expensive thing an investor can do: give up on something good before it has had the time to become great. Chapter 3. The Teacher Who Changed Everything. The rejection letter from Harvard Business School was brief, polite, and, in retrospect, one of the most consequential pieces of mail ever dropped into an American mailbox. Warren Buffett was 19 years old when he made the trip to Chicago to interview for a spot at Harvard. He had rehearsed, prepared, done everything right, or thought he had. The alumnus conducting the interview took one look at the skinny kid from Omaha who was barely old enough to shave with any conviction and delivered his verdict in under 10 minutes. Not ready. Harvard passed. Warren trudged back to the train station carrying the specific humiliation that only a confident young man who has been told no by the place he most wanted to impress can fully understand. He did not know yet that he had just been handed the luckiest rejection of his life. The consolation prize, if you could call it that, arrived in the form of a course catalog. Leafing through it with the half-hearted energy of someone making the best of a bad situation, Buffett landed on a name that stopped him cold. Benjamin Graham, Columbia University. Graham. The same Benjamin Graham who had written The Intelligent Investor, a book Warren had practically memorized, its spine cracked from repeated reading, its margins crowded with his own penciled notes. He had assumed Graham was a figure from another era, some distant financial philosopher who existed mainly in print. The discovery that this man was not only alive but actually teaching, accepting applications, walking into classrooms, handing out syllabi, hit Warren with the force of a genuine surprise, which for a young man who prided himself on knowing things, was saying something. He applied to Columbia immediately, with the barely contained urgency of someone who had just found out his favorite musician was playing a small club on Saturday night. His letter of application to Graham was, by most accounts, the most enthusiastic document Columbia's admissions office had seen in some time. Graham said yes. What Warren found when he walked into that Columbia classroom was not what he had been taught to expect from Wall Street. The world of investing, as most people understood it in the late 1940s, was a place of tips and hunches and cocktail party whispers, a casino dressed in a three-piece suit. Graham had no patience for any of it. He had spent years building the intellectual framework for something entirely different. The idea that a stock is not a number flickering on a ticker tape, not a rumor, not a bet. A stock is a piece of a real business, with real assets and real earnings, and if you buy it for less than it is actually worth, time will eventually correct the market's error in your favor. It sounds almost obvious now. In 1950, it was a revolution. Buffett absorbed it the way a dry field absorbs rain, completely and immediately, as if the ground had been waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. Here was a framework that made the world legible. Here was a way of thinking about money that rewarded patience and rigor rather than nerve and luck. For someone who had spent his entire boyhood cataloging information, studying patterns, finding the hidden logic in numbers, Graham's method was not a new philosophy so much as a confirmation of instincts Warren had always carried, but never had the language to describe. Graham himself was a remarkable character, erudite, witty, fond of classical literature in ways that his students found slightly bewildering given that he was supposed to be teaching finance. He believed that the market was essentially a moody neighbor, someone Graham famously named Mr. Market, who would show up each day with a different price for the same business, sometimes panicked, sometimes euphoric, always irrational. The investor's job was not to predict the neighbor's mood, but simply to take advantage of it, buy when Mr. Market was in despair, wait while everyone else argued about what the price should be, and let the underlying value of the business eventually make the case for itself. Warren took to this with an intensity that his classmates noted and his professors marveled at. He read annual reports the way other students read novels, chasing clues through balance sheets, turning the pages quickly until some undervalued company came into focus and he could feel the gap between price and worth. He arrived in class not just prepared but armed, his questions more detailed than the lecture material, his insights occasionally more precise than the lesson plan had accounted for. At the end of the year, Graham did something he had never done before in his career as a professor. He gave Warren Buffett an A+. That grade was not just an academic notation. It was one exceptional mind handing another its certificate of recognition, a moment where teacher and student both understood that something unusual had happened between them. Graham was not effusive in his praise. He did not need to be. The grade said it plainly enough. What followed the classroom was, in some ways, even more formative than the classroom itself. Warren so badly wanted to work for Graham that he offered to do it for free. Graham, characteristically practical, declined on the grounds that he preferred to hire people who needed the paycheck. Warren went back to Omaha, worked in his father's brokerage, wrote letters to Graham, and waited. Eventually, in 1954, Graham relented and brought him on board in New York. For 2 years, Buffett worked alongside his mentor, studying Graham's method from the inside, absorbing not just the philosophy but the texture of its application, how you actually looked at a company, what you ignored, what you trusted, where the human error crept in. When Graham retired and dissolved his partnership in 1956, Warren was 25 years old and possessed of something that could not be bought or borrowed, a complete intellectual system for understanding value installed in his brain by the one person best qualified to teach it, and refined by daily practice until it had become second nature. The Harvard rejection had steered him here. The Columbia acceptance had changed what he saw when he looked at the world. Graham had handed him not a set of stock tips but a way of thinking, clear, disciplined, almost stubbornly rational, that would compound in usefulness just as effectively as money compounds in interest, growing more powerful with every year that passed and every decision it informed. Young men are shaped by many forces: their families, their failures, their ambitions. Sometimes, if they are lucky and paying attention, they are shaped by a single teacher who arrives at exactly the right moment and says, in effect, "The thing you have been reaching for. Here it is, take it, it's yours." Warren Buffett had been that lucky, and he was paying that close of attention. Chapter 4. The Partnership Years. The arithmetic never lied. That was what Warren Buffett loved most about it, its stubborn, indifferent honesty. Numbers did not care who you were, how you dressed, or whether you had once sold bottles of Coca-Cola from a little red wagon in Omaha. They simply were what they were, and if you understood them better than everyone else in the room would eventually belong to you. In 1956, Warren came home to Omaha. He was 25 years old, newly married, with a baby at home, and exactly 0 job offers that interested him. His old mentor, Benjamin Graham, had closed his investment partnership in New York and retired to California to write poetry and study ancient Greek, which meant the one position Warren truly wanted had ceased to exist. Most young men in his situation would have knocked on doors, polished a resume, perhaps taken something sensible in banking. Warren instead called a few relatives and told them he had an idea. The pitch was not exactly Wall Street theater. 7 investors, his sister Doris, his Aunt Alice, his father-in-law, a handful of friends, gathered and agreed to pool their money. They contributed a combined $105,000. Warren contributed $100 of his own. $100. The figure slightly absurd even by the standards of 1956, as though he were buying in on principle rather than capital. But the terms were not conventional either. He would take a cut of profits above a 6% annual threshold, and he would manage the money with complete autonomy. No questions, no committees, no second-guessing. The investors would get letters updating them on performance, but they would not get explanations of the individual investments. He asked for trust, handed them essentially nothing in return for it, and they said yes. He was charming, of course. He has always been charming. But there was also something in his certainty that short-circuited doubt. He did not seem arrogant. He seemed certain the way a carpenter seems certain when he looks at a piece of wood and already knows the table inside it. Buffett Partnership Ltd. began operating out of a small office, and then, for years, essentially out of Warren's own head. He did not surround himself with analysts or assistants or the clattering apparatus of a professional firm. He read with the intensity of a man who believed that somewhere inside the tower of annual reports, proxy filings, and obscure trade publications stacked around him, a treasure was hiding, and patience was the only shovel required. He sometimes described these sessions as a kind of prospecting, the old-fashioned kind, where you sifted enormous quantities of worthless gravel and occasionally your pan flashed gold. He was looking for companies the market had either forgotten or misunderstood, businesses trading below their liquidation value, enterprises whose balance sheets told a different and more generous story than their stock prices suggested. These were not glamorous companies. They were dull, sometimes slightly decrepit businesses that Wall Street had stopped paying attention to, which was precisely what made them interesting. Wall Street's boredom was his opportunity. What the numbers produced year after year was almost comically unfair to every other investment manager alive. While the Dow Jones lumbered along with its ordinary gains and its ordinary losses, Buffett's partnership beat it, then beat it again, then beat it again. The compounding was quiet but relentless, the financial equivalent of a glacier moving, invisible in the day-to-day, astonishing over time. His partners would have been forgiven for wondering, in the early years, whether they were watching a genuine talent or a lucky streak. But lucky streaks do not last a decade, and talent, deep, disciplined, almost mechanical talent, tends to look, from the outside, suspiciously like magic. There were harder stretches, of course. There were years when Warren sat with a position that the market seemed determined to punish for far longer than logic should have allowed. Years when the gap between what he knew a business was worth and what the stock market insisted it was worth tested the outer boundaries of patience. The temptation in those moments, for any investor, is to wonder whether you've made an error, whether you missed something, whether the market, maddening, irrational, beautiful market, knows something you don't. Warren learned, in those quiet Omaha evenings with his reports spread across the desk, to sit with that discomfort, to trust the arithmetic, to wait. He was not, it should be said, a robot about it. He could be funny about his own obsessiveness, self-deprecating in the way that very confident people sometimes are, wearing their quirks lightly because they don't actually worry about them. He once admitted that he thought about money the way some people think about religion, which was either a warning or a confession depending on where you sat. He and Susan were building a life together in their modest Omaha home, raising their children with a cheerful normalcy that sat oddly alongside what he was quietly, methodically constructing in that little office. Susan managed the warmth and rhythm of the household. Warren managed everything else in his head. The world was changing fast in those years. The 1960s arrived with their cultural upheaval and their bull market and their glamour stocks, the so-called go-go growth companies that excited a generation of investors with their dazzling momentum and their sky-high price-to-earnings ratios. Warren watched all of it with polite detachment. He was not contemptuous exactly, but he was utterly unmoved. He had done the math. He knew what that kind of enthusiasm cost when the music stopped. By 1965, the partnership's record was impossible to ignore or dismiss. His partner's original investment had multiplied more than tenfold. The man who had walked into that family meeting with $100 of his own had turned trust into something close to alchemy. He was 34 years old and had already, by almost any reasonable measure, proven his point. He wound down the partnership a few years later, not because it had failed, but because he had grown restless with simply picking stocks in a market he increasingly felt was overheated and irrational. He wanted something sturdier beneath his feet. He wanted ownership, not fractional claims on public companies, but control, the ability to shape a business rather than simply bet on it. He had been doing something extraordinary in that small office, but he could sense, the way a great athlete sometimes senses the limit of one discipline, that the work he was truly meant to do required a different kind of canvas. He already had one in mind. Chapter 5. Berkshire and the Long Game. There is a particular kind of stubbornness that looks, from the outside, exactly like genius. Warren Buffett knew this. He had built a career on the gap between what the market believed and what was actually true. But in the mid-1960s, he made a bet so cantankerous, so driven by wounded pride, that he would spend the next several decades turning a mistake into a miracle, largely because he was too competitive to let it be anything else. The story of Berkshire Hathaway begins not with vision but with irritation. Buffett had been accumulating shares in a struggling Massachusetts textile company of the same name, and he'd reached a gentleman's agreement with the management. He would tender his shares at a certain price. Then, when the formal offer arrived in the mail, it came in at a price slightly lower than what he'd been promised. A fraction of a cent. The kind of difference that in another man would have prompted a shrug. In Warren Buffett, it prompted a buying spree. He purchased enough stock to seize control of the company outright, fired the executive who had slighted him, and sat down to face the consequences of his own temper. He had just bought a dying textile mill in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The looms were aging. The industry was migrating south, chasing cheaper labor, and no amount of operational ingenuity was going to reverse the physics of that. Buffett understood almost immediately that he had let his ego write a check his balance sheet would struggle to cash. He kept the textile operations running for years, partly out of loyalty to the workers, partly out of an almost stubborn refusal to simply walk away. But the money those operations generated was thin, unreliable, and frankly embarrassing compared to what he knew capital could do if properly deployed. He would later describe acquiring Berkshire Hathaway as his most expensive mistake, calculating that his irritation over that fraction of a cent betrayal may have cost his investors something in the range of $200 billion in foregone returns over the decades. Not a rounding error, not a lesson you learn cheaply. It was the kind of number that, if you let yourself stare at it too long, would make any rational person lie on the floor. But Buffett did not lie on the floor. What he did instead was something that in retrospect seems almost serene in its clarity, though it was almost certainly anything but serene to execute. He began to use Berkshire as a vessel, a corporate hull into which he could pour better businesses, smarter capital, more durable assets. The textile operation was the wound. What he built around it was the remedy. In 1967, he directed Berkshire to acquire National Indemnity, an insurance company based in Omaha, for $8.5 million. It was not a glamorous purchase. Insurance is not a business that makes children gasp in wonder. But Buffett understood something about insurance that most people missed entirely. It generates what he called float, the pool of premiums collected before claims are ever paid out. Float was essentially free money to invest. And in Warren Buffett's hands, free money to invest was a weapon of extraordinary power. The acquisitions began to accumulate. The Illinois National Bank, the Omaha Sun, See's Candies, the California confectioner that Charlie Munger practically had to drag him into purchasing in 1972. That last one deserves special mention because it was See's that cracked something open in Buffett's thinking, and the crowbar was Charlie Munger. Charles Thomas Munger was, by most accounts, the only person alive who could change Warren Buffett's mind. He was sharp in the way a cold wind is sharp, efficient, clarifying, slightly uncomfortable. Where Buffett had been trained by Benjamin Graham to hunt for deeply discounted businesses, cigar butts, as the strategy was known, companies you could get one last puff from before they expired, Munger kept pushing him toward a different question. Not how cheap is this company, but how good is it? Their arguments, conducted mostly by telephone between Omaha and Los Angeles, were the stuff of financial legend. Munger's essential thesis was simple and devastating. A truly wonderful business, one with durable competitive advantages and exceptional management, could compound value for decades without demanding constant reinvention. You could pay a fair price for it, not a bargain basement price, a fair one, and still come out spectacularly ahead simply because time would do the work. Quality, held long enough, obliterated the need for cleverness. See's Candies was the proof. Buffett paid $25 million for it, a price that made him wince. Over the following decades, it generated over $2 billion in pre-tax earnings. He stopped wincing. The philosophical upgrade that Munger provided was, in Buffett's own estimation, the single most important evolution in his investing career. It did not make the earlier lessons irrelevant. Price still mattered always, but it expanded the aperture through which he evaluated opportunity. Wonderful companies at fair prices. That became the operating principle, and Berkshire became its proving ground. What followed was a procession of acquisitions that reads, in hindsight, like a greatest hits album. Geico, the auto insurer he had loved since his early 20s and finally owned outright by 1996, the Buffalo News, General Re, Dairy Queen, BNSF Railway, the 2009 acquisition he called an all-in bet on America's future, the largest deal in Berkshire's history at the time, negotiated during a financial crisis while much of the investing world was too frightened to think straight. He was not frightened. Or perhaps he was, and simply found fear less interesting than opportunity. The textile mills finally closed in 1985. Buffett announced it matter-of-factly, with characteristic candor about the economics that made closure inevitable, and with genuine sorrow about the workers it affected. He was not unsentimental about it, but he had long since transformed the company into something so different from its origin that the name itself had become a kind of private joke between Buffett and history, a monument built on the foundation of a blunder, which is perhaps the most human kind of monument there is. By the time Berkshire Hathaway became one of the most expensive stocks ever traded, its price a number so large it felt theoretical, investors who had been with Buffett since the early days had watched their modest stakes balloon into generational wealth. A single share, purchased in 1965 for around $18, would grow in value to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The math was not magic, it was patience, compounded across decades, disciplined by a philosophy that two stubborn Midwesterners had argued into existence over the telephone. Berkshire was never just a portfolio. It was a statement about time, about trust, about what capital can become when it is guided by something more than the desire for a quick score. Warren Buffett had taken a dying mill in a moment of spite and built from them a canvas large enough to hold his life's work, brushstroke by patient brushstroke, until what hung there could only be called a masterpiece. Chapter 6: Love, Family, and the Omaha Way. The house on Farnham Street cost $31,500. Warren Buffett bought it in 1958, a 5-bedroom stucco number in a quiet Omaha neighborhood, and the running joke, told first by his friends, eventually by Warren himself, was that it was the last significant purchase he ever made without second-guessing the price. He never left. Decades later, when the rest of the world expected a man of his fortune to at minimum acquire a second home, a yacht, perhaps a modest island, Warren Buffett was still sleeping in the same house, still shuffling to the same kitchen, still a man whose address had not changed while his net worth added zeros the way most people add years. But a house, of course, is not a life, and behind the spreadsheets and the annual reports, behind the careful columns of numbers and the legendary self-discipline, there was a human story that was never quite as tidy as a balance sheet, and all the more worth telling for it. Susan Thompson was 21 years old when she married Warren Buffett in April of 1952, and from the very first she seemed to understand something essential about him, that his inner world was vast, and his outer social skills were, to put it charitably, a project in need of development. Warren has admitted with characteristic frankness that he was, before Susan, something close to a disaster in human interaction. Anxious in social situations, clumsy with emotion, a young man who could calculate compound interest in his sleep but struggled to have a casual conversation at a dinner party. Susan did not fix him so much as she translated him to the world, and translated the world back to him. She was warm where he was awkward. She sang, actually sang, with a real voice and real ambition, while he hummed tunelessly over stock reports. She collected people the way Warren collected companies, with an intuitive feel for hidden value. And she introduced the couple into Omaha's social circles with a grace that Warren alone never would have managed. Friends from that era describe her not as a woman standing behind a great man, but as the person who quietly and stubbornly made him a more complete one. They raised 3 children together, Susie, Howard, and Peter. The family lived modestly by any objective measure, certainly by the measure of what Warren was quietly accumulating in his partnerships. Their home was comfortable but not extravagant, the kind of house a successful dentist might have owned, and Warren seemed perfectly content with that arrangement. He was, in the domestic sense, a man of almost comical low maintenance, indifferent to fancy food, indifferent to decor, capable of consuming the same hamburger and the same cherry Coke with the same satisfaction day after day. Susan provided the color and warmth the household needed, and in exchange he provided the security and the stability, and they made for a long time a genuinely good team. But Susan Thompson Buffett was not a woman whose story was simply a supporting role in someone else's. She had passions and ambitions of her own, a voice she wanted to use, a sense of self that extended beyond Omaha and the considerable gravitational pull of her husband's world. In 1977, she moved to San Francisco. It was not a thunderclap. There was no public scandal, no courtroom drama, no dramatic severing of ties. It was quieter and in some ways more complicated than any of those things. A gentle, mutual recognition that the life she needed to live could not entirely be lived in the house on Farnham Street. They never divorced. They remained close, speaking regularly, appearing together at family events, presenting to the world a partnership reconfigured but not destroyed. People who knew them well said they seemed, in some ways, more at ease with each other after the separation, freed from the daily friction of incompatible needs, able to simply love each other as the people they actually were. Warren, for his part, has spoken about Susan with a tenderness that carries no performance in it, no carefully managed public relations warmth. She shaped him, he has said, in ways that went deeper than any business lesson he ever learned. And then there was Astrid. Astrid Minks was a waitress at a French cafe in Omaha, a Latvian immigrant with a quiet steadiness about her, and the detail that history loves most is this. It was Susan who introduced them. Before she left for San Francisco, Susan worried about leaving Warren alone. Not about the money, that was never going to be the problem, but about the practical human business of daily life. The meals, the companionship, the basic maintenance of a person who was capable of forgetting to eat if a particularly interesting annual report arrived. She introduced Warren to Astrid, and whether this was an act of extraordinary generosity or extraordinary practicality or simply both at once, it is one of the stranger and more genuinely touching arrangements in the long annals of complicated marriages. The three of them, Warren in Omaha with Astrid, Susan in San Francisco, maintained what their friends described as a real friendship, not a polite fiction. Holiday cards went out signed by all three of them. Warren and Astrid and Susan attended events together. The world, conditioned to expect scandal or tragedy in such a triangle, largely found neither. It found instead three adults who had made an unusual peace with unusual circumstances and who seemed, on the evidence available, to have chosen honesty and affection over convention and resentment. Susan was diagnosed with oral cancer in 2003. She died on July 29, 2004 in Cody, Wyoming, at the age of 72. By all accounts, Warren was devastated in the way that people are devastated when they lose the person who understood them first and longest, not just grief for a presence removed, but grief for a whole version of yourself that only one person ever truly knew. He wept publicly, which was not something the world had seen from him before. He married Astrid 2 years later in a small ceremony in Omaha on his 76th birthday, with close family present and the world learning about it mostly afterward. The house on Farnham Street still stands, worth far less as a percentage of its owner's fortune than it was the day he bought it, a mathematical absurdity that Warren Buffett almost certainly finds quietly funny. He chose it, and he kept it, long past every reasonable justification to move somewhere grander. There is something in that choice, something that speaks to the same instinct that kept Susan close even after the marriage changed shape, that kept Astrid without fanfare or announcement, that kept the whole complicated human story of his private life rooted in the same square mile of the same Midwestern city. The spreadsheets told one story. Farnham Street told another, messier, more important one, and it was the story of a man who valued what he had, even when he had more than he could ever spend. Chapter 7. The Richest Man on Earth. Picture this: the most admired investor on the planet, sitting in his modest Omaha office with no Bloomberg terminal humming beside him, no real-time ticker crawling across a second monitor, no monitor at all, really. Just a man, a stack of annual reports thick enough to stun a horse, and a cherry Coke sweating quietly on the desk. By the mid-1990s, Warren Buffett had become something the financial world is not especially designed to produce, a rich man the ordinary person genuinely liked. That is a stranger achievement than it sounds. America has always had billionaires, but it has treated most of them the way a dog treats a thunderstorm, with suspicion, periodic outrage, and a desire to get far away from the window. The robber barons inspired legislation, the junk bond kings inspired prison sentences, the hedge fund crowd inspired a genre of movies in which they are invariably the villains. And then there was Warren, eating a sausage and egg McMuffin at McDonald's, driving a modest Cadillac he had purchased without drama, waving to the toll booth attendant on his way to work, and somehow accumulating one of the greatest fortunes in human history while the public watched with a feeling closer to affection than fury. Part of the explanation lives in a single document published once a year, his letter to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders. Most corporate shareholder letters are written by lawyers, reviewed again by different lawyers, and then passed through a final filter of lawyers before emerging as something that reads approximately like the terms and conditions nobody reads. Buffett wrote his own. He had been doing it since he ran his partnership in the 1950s and 1960s, and the habit had calcified into a kind of annual literary event. Every February, the new letter would arrive, and people who did not own a single share of Berkshire would read it anyway, forwarding it to friends, quoting it in boardrooms, printing it out, and folding it into their jacket pockets like a sermon they wanted nearby. He wrote about insurance float and return on equity, yes, but he also wrote about his mistakes with the blunt, slightly self-flagellating honesty of a man confessing at a small-town church. He wrote about human nature, about fear and greed as market forces, about why he avoided businesses he did not understand even when they were making everyone else rich. He was funny, genuinely, consistently funny, in the way that a person is funny when they have simply observed the world long enough to see the absurdity baked into it. He once compared a particular acquisition to a toad that he had expected to turn into a prince after he kissed it. The toad, he admitted, had remained a toad. The letters were read, over the decades, by millions of people who came for the investing wisdom and stayed for the company because Buffett on the page felt like someone you could trust. That trust was not accidental. It rested on something people could observe, verify, and poke at. The remarkable, almost comical consistency between what he said and how he lived. He had bought his house in Omaha in 1958 for $31,500, and he was still in it. Not as a publicity stunt, not because he lacked the means to upgrade, but because the house suited him, the neighborhood suited him, and the whole premise of trading a place you love for something grander simply because you could afford it struck him as a peculiar reason to make a change. He knew his neighbors, he had a routine, he liked his cherry Coke and his hamburgers and his occasional sundae from the local Dairy Queen, a company, it should be noted, that Berkshire eventually acquired, possibly because the man doing the acquiring simply could not stop eating there. He paid himself $100,000 a year. In context, this is a number that requires a moment to absorb. $100,000 for the chairman of a company that had grown into one of the most valuable enterprises on earth. His cleaning staff, he sometimes joked, cost Berkshire more in aggregate than he did. The salary was not a performance of humility. It was consistent with a philosophy he had held for decades, that his real compensation was not a paycheck, but the opportunity to keep doing what he loved, which was reading, thinking, and allocating capital in roughly that order. He called it tap dancing to work. The phrase became famous, repeated in profiles and interviews and commencement addresses until it risked becoming cliché, but there was something underneath it that refused to go hollow. The man meant it. He had never felt compelled to separate his work from his life, because for Warren Buffett, reading a corporate filing over a cherry Coke and asking himself whether the economics of a business made permanent sense was not suffering. It was the thing. It was the whole thing. In 2008, the financial world convulsed in ways that destroyed institutions a century old, vaporized retirement accounts, and left serious people wondering whether the machinery of capitalism had finally broken beyond repair. In the middle of that chaos, Forbes placed Warren Buffett at the top of its list of the world's wealthiest individuals, briefly, spectacularly, at an estimated net worth of around $62 billion. The title of world's richest person had been an address he had circled for years, finally alighted upon, and would not hold for long. But for a moment it was his. He did not move. He did not throw a party. He did not buy a yacht, a second yacht, or any yacht. He continued to live in the house, drive the car, eat the hamburgers, and show up at the low-slung Berkshire offices in Kiewit Plaza, where his organization operated with a skeleton crew that would have seemed implausibly small for a company of its scale. He kept no computer on his desk, navigated no spreadsheet software, sent no emails. What he did do, all day, every day, was read filings, reports, newspapers, trade publications. He has estimated that he spent 80% of his working life simply reading, which is the kind of admission that sounds lazy until you consider that this particular reader had compounded money at rates that made mathematicians slightly uncomfortable. There is something clarifying about a man who accumulates more money than almost any human being in history and then demonstrates, year after year, that the money itself was never really the point. The point was the game, the endlessly renewable puzzle of figuring out what a business was truly worth, what the market had gotten wrong, what time would eventually correct. The fortune was the score, not the prize. The prize was getting to keep playing. America tends to make its wealthy figures into symbols of aspiration or resentment, rarely finding a third option. Warren Buffett somehow became the third option, a reminder that extraordinary success and ordinary decency are not, in the end, mutually exclusive, and that a man can be the richest person on earth and still be, by any reasonable accounting, recognizably himself. Chapter 8. The Pledge That Stunned the World. Sometime in the spring of 2006, Warren Buffett did something that no one in his tax bracket had ever quite managed before. He decided he didn't want all his money. This requires a moment of genuine appreciation for how strange that sentence is. The man had spent the better part of 5 decades constructing one of the great fortunes in human history, brick by meticulous brick, company by carefully chosen company. He had deferred vacations, kept the same house, and driven himself to work in ordinary cars while sitting on a pile of wealth that would have made the pharaohs feel financially insecure. And then, in the summer of 2006, he called a press conference and announced he was giving most of it away, not just a meaningful slice, not a respectable chunk that would still leave him comfortably among the top 10 wealthiest people alive. He pledged roughly 85% of his Berkshire Hathaway stock, at the time valued at around $37 billion, to charity, the largest private donation in the history of American philanthropy, delivered with the same calm, unpretentious manner with which he might have recommended a good steakhouse in Omaha. The bulk of it would go to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, with additional tranches designated for foundations run by his children and the one established in honor of Susan, who had died only 2 years earlier. Reporters at the announcement kept waiting for the catch, some golden asterisk buried in the fine print that would make the gesture more comprehensible, more Wall Street. There wasn't one. Buffett had thought about this for a long time, and thinking carefully before acting was, after all, his defining professional virtue. One of the objections he had turned over in his mind, and that his critics would later attempt to raise, was whether concentrating so much philanthropic power in a single institution was wise. His answer was characteristically direct. The Gates Foundation had demonstrated both the will and the operational competence to attack the world's worst problems, from malaria to polio to the basic mathematics of poverty. He was not giving money to an idea. He was giving money to people who knew how to spend it toward measurable ends. And if there was one quality Warren Buffett admired in any enterprise, it was competent management with clear objectives. Bill Gates, for his part, admitted he had been somewhat dumbfounded. The two men had built an unlikely friendship over the years, one that confounded the shorthand categorization of both: the Omaha value investor who ate like a 10-year-old, and the Seattle technologist who had redefined modern commerce. They played bridge together. They argued cheerfully about history and economics, and somewhere in those conversations, Buffett had apparently decided that his friend's foundation was the most efficient vehicle he could find for deploying capital toward human welfare. Efficiency mattered enormously to him. This was not sentiment dressed up as strategy. He had spent decades resisting pressure to give money away sooner, not because he lacked generosity, but because he genuinely believed that dollars compounding inside Berkshire Hathaway would ultimately be worth more to the world than those same dollars donated prematurely. $1 million in 1970 became something far more useful in 2006. It was, in a way, the most patient act of charity imaginable, waiting until the gift would be large enough to actually matter at scale. Critics still found things to argue with. Some noted that the pledge preserved enormous influence over the companies Berkshire owned for decades longer, since Buffett retained his voting shares. Others felt the sheer scale of two wealthy friends pooling resources concentrated too much philanthropic decision-making in too few hands. These were not unreasonable concerns, and Buffett did not dismiss them with irritation. He acknowledged the complexity and moved forward anyway, which was, again, very much his style. What followed in 2010 was, if anything, even bolder in its ambition. Buffett and Gates co-launched something called the Giving Pledge, a public commitment campaign aimed at persuading the world's wealthiest individuals to dedicate the majority of their fortunes to philanthropy, either during their lifetimes or through their estates. The pitch was simple and the target audience was unusual. Billionaires, a demographic not historically known for being easily persuaded of anything. And yet it worked. Buffett and Gates made personal phone calls, hosted intimate dinners, and sat across tables from some of the most formidable egos in global business, making a case that was at once practical and moral. By any measure, the response was remarkable. Within the first year, dozens of signatories had joined. Within the decade, more than 200 billionaires and families from across the world had added their names. What made Buffett's appeal so effective, people who witnessed those early conversations later said, was that he never moralized. He didn't guilt anyone or quote scripture or construct elaborate philosophical arguments about the obligations of the ultra-wealthy. He simply talked about what money could actually do at that scale, how many children's lives could be saved from preventable disease, how many young people could access education that would otherwise be denied to them. He talked about it the way he had always talked about a good investment. Here is the opportunity, here is the return, here is why the math makes sense. Except the return he was describing was measured in human lives rather than compound interest. There is something quietly radical buried in all of this, something that gets lost in the headline figures. The dominant mythology of American wealth accumulation has always carried an unspoken final chapter, a dynasty, a legacy institution bearing the family name, a fortune handed down through generations as both inheritance and monument. Buffett rejected that model almost entirely. His children were not going to receive a life-altering inheritance. Berkshire Hathaway was not going to be transformed into a family holding. The money was going to leave the family and go to work in the world. He was clear-eyed about why. He had said for years that he believed in giving his children enough to do anything, but not so much that they could do nothing. He had watched wealthy families collapse under the weight of inherited fortune, watched ambition curdle and purpose dissolve when the fundamental human need to build something was removed. The greatest gift, in his view, was not the fortune itself. It was the lucky accident of being born into circumstances that allowed you to discover what you were genuinely good at, and then the freedom to spend your life doing it. What he was giving the world, in other words, was not just $37 billion. It was an argument, loud, visible, and backed by an almost incomprehensible personal sacrifice, that wealth is not the destination. It never was. It is the tool, and a tool left sitting in the drawer while people suffer unnecessarily is simply waste. In reframing his own fortune as a means rather than an end, Warren Buffett did something that no stock price could ever fully capture. He put his money exactly where his philosophy had always lived. Chapter 9. Wisdom in Winter. There is a photograph that circulated widely in the early 2020s. Warren Buffett, somewhere north of 90 years old, sitting in Omaha with a cherry Coke and a copy of a financial report thick enough to use as a doorstop, looking for all the world like a man who had not yet noticed that the rest of the financial universe had lost its mind. Markets were gyrating. Cryptocurrencies were minting millionaires on Tuesday and vaporizing them by Thursday. Special purpose acquisition companies were raising billions of dollars for businesses that had neither revenue nor, in some cases, an actual product. And there sat the Oracle of Omaha, reading, sipping, thinking, unbothered in the particular way that only a man who has watched many panics come and go can manage to be unbothered. Age, it turned out, had not softened Buffett's discipline. If anything, it had clarified it, the way decades of heat and pressure clarify carbon into something very hard and very valuable. He still arrived at the office each morning. He still read 5 newspapers before most people had silenced their alarm clocks. He still spent the overwhelming majority of his working hours doing something that looked from the outside like sitting quietly, but which was in practice one of the most rigorous intellectual exercises in American business, thinking carefully before acting. The problem, or at least the puzzle, was that acting had become genuinely difficult. Berkshire Hathaway was sitting on a cash pile that would make smaller nations dizzy, at various points topping $100 billion, and eventually surging well past that figure. In an earlier era, Buffett would have deployed such capital with methodical aggression, picking off undervalued companies the way a patient hunter waits for the right moment. But the era of easy targets had long passed. Valuations had inflated. Private equity firms competed ferociously for acquisitions, driving prices to levels that made Buffett's stomach turn. He said publicly, with characteristic plainness, that he couldn't find anything worth buying at the prices being asked, and that he wasn't going to pay up just because the cash was making him uncomfortable. Patience, he reminded anyone who would listen, was not a strategy you abandoned when it became inconvenient. That would rather defeat the point. He was candid, too, about the ones that had gotten away. Amazon was the wound he prodded openly, almost with a kind of self-deprecating disbelief. He had watched Jeff Bezos build something extraordinary and had admired it enormously, and still managed not to buy the stock because he had convinced himself he couldn't predict how it would unfold. Google was another. He had seen it up close, had evidence of its durable competitive advantages, and had passed. These were not small misses. These were the kinds of misses that, had he made the opposite call, would have compounded into sums almost too large to articulate. He admitted this with a rueful grin that was part confession and part comedy, shaking his head at his own failure to simply act on what he understood. The man who had built his career on the sin of omission, the idea that the biggest investing mistakes are not the things you buy but the things you fail to buy, had committed the sin himself at grand scale in plain sight. He seemed to find this both mortifying and, in the long view, darkly funny. What was not funny, not even slightly, was November 28, 2023. Charlie Munger died at 99 years old, 34 days short of his 100th birthday, and Warren Buffett lost something that no financial instrument could price. The two men had been partners for more than 5 decades, not just in the legal or professional sense, but in the deeper sense of two minds that had become so thoroughly intertwined that neither could quite be understood without reference to the other. Charlie was the one who pushed, who challenged, who told Warren he was being a fool when he was being a fool, which is the rarest and most valuable thing one person can offer another. He was the one who had nudged Buffett away from the pure Graham doctrine of buying mediocre businesses at bargain prices and towards something more elegant, the conviction that a truly wonderful business, bought at a fair price, would outperform a merely cheap business in the long run because quality compounds in ways that discount alone cannot. Buffett's tribute to Munger was not long. It didn't need to be. He called Charlie the architect of what Berkshire had become, and said simply that Berkshire could not have been built to its present state without him. Coming from a man who had spent his career being precise with language, the acknowledgement was enormous in its understatement. The absence of Charlie Munger at the annual shareholder meeting the following year was a presence in itself. A chair, a microphone, a place where the quick dry wit and the cheerful contrarianism had once lived and now did not. Buffett showed up anyway. This was, in its quiet way, the most revealing thing about him. Grief in public life often performs itself, becoming a kind of theater. Buffett's grief was the other kind, the kind that sits down at the desk the next morning because sitting down at the desk is what you do, because the work is not separate from the meaning, because the alternative to showing up is not showing up, and that was never seriously on the table. He was in his 90s. He had outlived his first wife, his closest partner, and several chapters of American financial history, and still, every morning, the newspapers. Still every week, the annual reports. Still every year, the shareholder letter, written in his own hand, in his own voice, without a public relations team polishing the edges into corporate smoothness. The annual meeting in Omaha remained an improbable spectacle. Tens of thousands of people making pilgrimages to Nebraska, not exactly a destination city, to sit in an arena and listen to a man in his 90s answer questions for hours without notes, without teleprompter, without visible preparation, just decades of compressed thought flowing out in plain sentences that somehow managed to be both wise and genuinely funny. He deflected flattery with practiced ease. He admitted uncertainty without embarrassment. He told the truth about what he didn't know, which turns out to be an extraordinarily rare thing in rooms that contain very large amounts of money. There was something almost paradoxical about it. The older he got, the more contemporary his essential lesson felt. In an age of instant information and algorithmic trading and 24-hour news cycles designed to induce panic or euphoria depending on the hour, the most powerful investing philosophy in the world turned out to be the simplest and the hardest. Think long, act carefully, trust in the fundamental human capacity to solve problems and build things that endure. Warren Buffett, approaching the outer edge of his 10th decade, still believed that. He still showed up, still read, still thought, still wagered his confidence on the one thing he had never stopped trusting. That time, given enough of it, remains the most powerful compounding force in the known universe, and that the people who understand this and can resist the temptation to panic in the intervals between will almost always, in the end, be all right. Chapter 10. The Enduring Oracle. Somewhere in Omaha, on any given weekday morning, a man in his mid-90s drives himself to work. He stops, some days for a sausage biscuit at McDonald's. He decides which one he wants based on how the stock market opened. The worse the morning in New York, the more expensive the breakfast he allows himself. He arrives at a modest office building, rides to his floor, pours a cherry Coke, and begins reading. He has been doing some version of this for longer than most of his employees have been alive. This is Warren Buffett at the end of the story, and also, somehow, still in the middle of it. The word legacy tends to make people reach for marble and bronze, for plaques and monuments that will outlast the weather. Buffett's legacy has always been stranger and more alive than that. It is housed not in a museum but in a company, Berkshire Hathaway, which began life as a failing New England textile mill and has become, through decades of quiet accumulation and steadfast judgment, one of the most valuable enterprises in the history of capitalism. The numbers are almost comically large. A market capitalization that nudges past $500 billion, hundreds of thousands of employees spread across insurance and railroads and energy grids and fast food and jewelry stores and a dozen other industries that, on paper, have no business belonging to the same family, and yet they do, held together less by corporate strategy than by a shared culture of decency and long thinking that Buffett insisted on from the beginning. He will be the first to tell you that he got plenty wrong. He missed Amazon. He missed Google. He sat on mountains of cash during periods when deploying it would have looked, in retrospect, obvious. He bought a textile company that had no real future and spent years nursing it rather than pulling the plug sooner. For a man so often described as infallible, he has a remarkable willingness to enumerate his own errors, doing so in his annual letters with a self-deprecating candor that would embarrass most executives into silence. Mistakes, he has said in various forms over many decades, are how you learn not to make the same mistake twice. He has made some of them twice anyway. He admits that too. Those annual letters, sent to Berkshire shareholders every year since the 1960s, have become something genuinely unusual in American life. Financial documents that people actually want to read, not because they explain arcane instruments or promise secret formulas, but because they read like letters from a wise, funny uncle who happens to know everything about money and is willing to tell you most of it in plain English. There is a warmth to them, and a wit and an unfashionable willingness to say, "I don't know," when the honest answer is that no one does. In a world that rewards confident wrongness, Buffett's calibrated uncertainty has always felt like its own kind of genius. Every spring, something remarkable happens in Omaha. It has been called, without much exaggeration, Woodstock for capitalists. Tens of thousands of people descend on the city for Berkshire Hathaway's annual shareholder meeting, a weekend-long event that fills a convention center with investors and tourists and students and the simply curious, all of them hungry for something. Some want investment wisdom. Some want the chance to ask a question from the floor microphone. Some just want to stand in the same room as a man who has become, in the fullest sense, a living argument for a certain way of moving through the world. It is a strange and earnest pilgrimage, and there is almost nothing else like it anywhere. What draws them, those tens of thousands, is not really the portfolio. Anyone can read about the portfolio. What draws them is harder to name. A kind of moral reassurance, maybe, that patience is not naive, that integrity is not commercially suicidal, that a person can build something extraordinary without burning everyone around them to do it. In an era of disruption for its own sake and quarterly earnings anxiety and influencers selling courses on wealth, Buffett represents an almost radical proposition. Slow down, think clearly, be honest, and wait. It should not feel countercultural. It does. The loss of Charlie Munger in late 2023 left a silence that no one has fully filled. Buffett grieved openly, calling Munger the architect of so much of what Berkshire became, the voice that pushed harder thinking, the friend who would tell him with cheerful bluntness when he was wrong. Those who watched Buffett in the months after understood that this was not a business loss being processed with business language. It was an old man missing his closest companion of half a century. Whatever resolve Buffett has shown in continuing, and he has continued, showing up every morning with his Coke and his newspapers and his reports, it has carried the weight of that absence inside it. And yet, here is the thing about Warren Buffett that resists every attempt to make him purely elegiac. He is still curious. At an age when most people have decided what they think, he keeps reading, keeps updating, keeps finding something interesting in the next earnings report or the next letter from a company manager or the next question from a college student visiting his office. The curiosity is not performative. It is constitutional. He has said that the best investment he ever made was in himself. In his own knowledge, accumulated one annual report and one book at a time over 9 decades, and you believe him because you can see it still running in real time. What he will leave behind eventually is a list that is almost impossible to fully grasp. The philanthropic commitments alone will reshape institutions for generations. The company will outlast its founder, shaped by the culture he installed so carefully that it seems designed to survive without him. The letters will be read long after the man who wrote them is gone, parsed and quoted the way certain poems are quoted, not for data but for the feeling they produce. But perhaps the truest monument is the simplest one. It is the idea, demonstrated over 9.5 decades, that you do not have to be ruthless to be successful, that the world, properly understood, rewards the patient and the honest with more than it rewards the clever and the quick, that the best deal you will ever make is not some leveraged acquisition or perfectly timed trade. It is the investment you make in your own character and in the people you choose to trust, and in the willingness to keep showing up every morning even when the market opens badly and all you really want is the sausage biscuit anyway. Warren Buffett is still showing up. In the end, every life asks the same question. What did it leave behind? Subscribe, and let's explore the next answer together.